What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and we are just beginning spoiler season for 11th edition. Already, we've received some preview articles, and I'm happy to say that we are seeing some reports come in from conferences between tournament organizers and Games Workshop that are reinforcing or extrapolating on some of the things that we have been given. And today, I'm going to go through some of that information that is going around the Warhammer sphere right now. But for those who don't know, when you construct your army, you're going to pick up to 3 detachments using a new resource called detachment points. According to these conferences, detachments that have abilities that affect your whole army, like Gladius Task Force, are going to cost 3 points. However, there will be more narrow 1 or 2 point detachments that will focus on specific units that get the benefits from that detachment. Essentially, according to this, any of the detachments that are built using the 10th edition style, where they affect everything in your army, will be 3-point detachments, where new detachments that are coming out that will be more focused on specific unit types or unit keywords will cost those smaller points values. According to the article we got earlier, based on the detachments that you bring, you are given a selection of force dispositions. These are keywords that your army will adopt that are available based on the detachments that you pick. Each detachment will give you a selection of these keywords, and you choose one when building your army. When you get to the table, you and your opponent compare force dispositions. You can't change them after army construction, so you have to pick one when you build your army. However, once you get to the table, that comparison between your 2 force dispositions will actually determine the mission that you play. In addition, according to these conference notes, each matchup will have its own layout that is dependent on the mission, which is also dependent on the disposition of those 2 armies that are playing. You don't choose anything at the table. It's the combination of your and your opponent's disposition that then picks the mission that you're playing on. Apparently, according to these conferences, how terrain is then assigned for that pairing is based on a layout. Each mission will have its own terrain layout, which means that we may need to reset terrain between games, which is unfortunately going to be very time consuming, especially given some of the other information that we're given in these. However, this is mutable. You play either layout A, B, or C, which is determined by the tournament organizer and assigned to that mission combination. So, for example, based on my and my opponent's force dispositions, we could determine that we are playing mission 1, and if we look at our event roster for that event that we're playing in, or if we determine that if we're playing a casual game, we'll see that we can play either layout A, B, or C. If we're playing a tournament, the tournament organizer may have said just play layout A for round 1, so we will set up layout A, mission 1, without any additional input from any other source. So while primary objective is prescriptive based on the 2 force dispositions of you and your opponent's army, secondary objectives are not. Unfortunately, according to these notes, there are no faction-specific secondaries. Instead, there are going to be secondaries that we all have access to. However, you can build them into a hand of secondaries. The notes that I've read so far are a little contradictory on exactly how this works, but it seems that this is enabled by holding more than just 2 secondaries in your hand over the course of the game. So, whereas currently you would be forced to begin discarding cards or hold them in your hand if you can't score them, in 11th edition, if you don't score a secondary, you can hold it to attempt to score again on a future turn, but continuously draw new secondaries, enabling you to potentially score multiple. I don't know, however, if there is a cap to the number of secondaries that you can score in a single turn. In addition to that, it seems that you can also hold as many secondaries in your hand as you want to, so not completing multiple secondaries is not the end of the world. You can hold them to complete them on a future turn, although I imagine there's a limit on the number of cards that you can complete in one turn. From there, terrain was a huge question. Apparently, all of this information is going to be released essentially alongside, if not slightly before, the release of the actual edition, which will be nice. They did say that most existing footprints will be usable in the new edition. However, there will be a couple of new footprint styles that will not fit any existing terrain. That includes a 10x2 footprint, so super long and skinny, as well as triangles and other smaller template sizes. There's definitely been a narrative in a lot of the information that I've been reading recently that the Games Workshop Tournament's Companion is trying very hard to either superimpose itself over alternative formats like WTC, for example, and it seems like they are straying farther and farther away from a compatible format of terrain from what the WTC uses to try to convince WTC organizers to play the official Games Workshop format. That seems like it's going to be a pretty controversial issue and a hard-fought discussion, so how that ends up actually influencing the community is going to be interesting. In addition, these notes have also confirmed that you will be able to use existing terrain features, but the templates may change, and in some cases with those new templates, you will be required to source new terrain features, but your existing collection should still apply to templates that are similar to the existing ones. Apparently, the line of sight rules have not changed, however. There is this new mechanic where while you're in terrain and not attacking your opponent, you are concealed and are more difficult to shoot at from enemies that are far away from you. However, you are still in line of sight if you touch a terrain feature, which means that, unfortunately, L's and U-shaped ruin walls will likely be back in. It's sort of an unfortunate circumstance of 40k's core mechanics that it's very difficult to get away from these terrain features. They block lots of lines of sight, they allow for staging points for infantry and other lighter units that are easy to kill, and they just work really well with the mechanics of the game. It is unfortunate that it seems like Games Workshop is reticent to actually construct rules that allow you to play alternative types of terrain within their format. Rules for occupying enclosed buildings, for example. That could be very interesting, but without those, we are going to be stuck with ruined walls, and it seems like that's what Games Workshop really wants to push. In addition, we also have a couple of other rumors about these terrain formats, specifically that they will be more dense than the existing format. The number given is somewhere around 16 terrain footprints per layout, which, if you have to set that up before each game, especially in a multi-round tournament that could round 3 or maybe even 4 rounds in a day, that's brutal. I hope it doesn't end up being that dense, but I do look forward to having lots of different terrain features that will make lines of sight and maneuvering around the table much more interesting than it is currently in 10th edition. In addition to that, as was discussed in Games Workshop's livestream, and as I'm sure we'll see in their Warhammer community articles shortly, objectives are now tied to terrain features. So specific terrain features will score you points for holding them. Exactly how that works, however, we don't quite yet know, but I'm sure we'll see that soon as we move deeper into spoiler season. Altogether, there will be 15 total missions with 3 layouts listed for each. Whether that means 45 total layouts or those 3 layouts are reused based on the mission, I don't 100% yet know. I do think it will probably be based around the deployment zones that those missions recommend, but I do think it will likely be based around the deployment zones that you get for whatever that mission is. There was also a question about this detachment construction system and whether or not it allows multiple sub-faction keywords or chapters to be mixed as it did in previous editions, where you could, in 8th edition, for example, bring one detachment that is Ultramarines and one detachment that is Blood Angels. And unfortunately, the answer is no. Mixed armies of multiple different sub-factions are dead in 11th edition, at least from a mechanical standpoint. And with that, that's all the information I have for you today. Honestly, I'm kind of excited to see exactly how these mechanics work. I do love the idea of long and thin ruin structures, single ruin walls, for example, that our units can hide behind. I think it's going to make maneuvering around the battlefield much more interesting without having to deal with the large, big L's or huge rectangles that we currently have to sort of tiptoe around in order to not be seen by our opponent. And things like small terrain features that can block specific lines of sight, or large, wide terrain features that can offer a lot of frontage for big units while still remaining out of line of sight, are really interesting. Also, an interesting thing to mention is thin terrain is more difficult to tow into to become concealed and difficult to shoot at. So, in some cases, it might even be a detriment to have terrain that's more difficult to fit your unit inside. I really like the implications of this more in-depth philosophy towards terrain and mission construction. I have a personal philosophy that I think all miniature games should embed mission design and recommended terrain into their core rules, because if you don't do that, you do end up with situations where the community ends up being fractured by people playing with wildly different terrain. It becomes difficult to play cross different communities if you go from one game store to another. It's difficult to play if they play on different missions or if they play on different terrain, and it also allows you to do more interesting things with unit mechanics that rely specifically on objectives. We've been seeing a ton of that brought into the game in 10th edition, and it sounds like we're going to have even more of that in 11th edition. Thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Thanks as well to everybody who supports Tactical Tortoise, whether that's over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members, Twitch subscribers. All you people are amazing. And I love you. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.